At the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, there's a Nazi submarine carrying enough gold to make you one of the richest people on Earth. We're talking about billions of dollars in precious metals, sitting in a steel coffin 2 miles below the surface. This is the story of U-864, the submarine that was supposed to save the Third Reich, and the treasure that's been lying on the ocean floor for almost 80 years. Our story begins in late 1944. Nazi Germany is losing the war badly. The Allies have liberated France. The Soviets are pushing from the east. German cities are being reduced to rubble by Allied bombers. Hitler's thousand-year Reich is collapsing after just 12 years. But the Nazis have one last desperate plan. Germany and Japan are still allies, and Japan is also losing its war in the Pacific. The Americans are island-hopping toward the Japanese home islands. Japan desperately needs advanced technology to turn the tide, and Germany desperately needs raw materials that Japan can provide. So a deal is struck. U-864 is assigned one of the most critical missions of the entire war. This isn't a combat patrol. This isn't about sinking Allied ships. This is about delivering technology and weapons to Japan that could change the course of the war. We're talking about jet engine designs, rocket technology, uranium oxide for atomic weapons research, and German engineers who would teach the Japanese how to build their own advanced weapons. But here's where it gets interesting. To pay for the raw materials Germany wanted from Japan, things like rubber, tungsten, and other strategic resources, U-864 was loaded with payment. 67 tons of mercury, which was incredibly valuable for weapons manufacturing. And according to reports that have circulated for decades, tons of gold. Actual Nazi gold. Some estimates put the value at over $3 billion in today's money. The submarine left Germany in December 1944, commanded by Korvettenkapitän Ralph Reimar Wolfram. But almost immediately, things started going wrong. U-864 was a Type 9D2 U-boat, one of the largest submarines Germany built. But it had engine problems, serious ones. The submarine had to turn back for repairs multiple times. By early February 1945, U-864 finally set out again, this time determined to make it to Japan. The route was insane. The submarine would have to travel underwater around the northern coast of Norway, then across the entire Atlantic, around the southern tip of Africa, across the Indian Ocean, and finally to Japan. Thousands of miles, all while being hunted by Allied forces. The British knew something was up. Their intelligence services had broken German codes, and they knew a high-value submarine was trying to break out into the Atlantic. They didn't know exactly what was on board, but they knew it was important enough to stop at all costs. On February 9, 1945, U-864 was traveling submerged off the coast of Norway, near the island of Fiji. The submarine was running silent, trying to slip past British patrols. But the British submarine HMS Venturer was hunting in the same area, commanded by Lieutenant James Launders. What happened next was one of the most remarkable achievements in naval warfare history. Venturer detected U-864 on sonar. Both submarines were underwater. This was extremely rare. Submarine warfare almost always involved a submarine attacking surface ships. Submarines fighting each other while both were submerged was nearly unheard of. Launders faced an impossible problem. He couldn't see U-864. He could only track it by sound. And torpedoes in 1945 didn't have guidance systems. Once you fired them, they traveled in a straight line. Hitting a moving target underwater, when you couldn't see it and had to predict where it would be several minutes in the future, was almost impossible. For over 2 hours, Launders tracked U-864, trying to plot its course. He calculated the German submarine's speed, its depth, and its heading. Then he made a decision that would go down in history. He fired 4 torpedoes in a spread pattern, aiming at where he predicted U-864 would be. The first torpedo missed. The second torpedo missed. The third torpedo missed. But the fourth torpedo hit U-864 directly amidships. The explosion was catastrophic. The submarine broke apart and sank immediately, plunging toward the ocean floor over 600 feet below. All 73 crew members were killed instantly. This was the first and only time in history that one submerged submarine successfully sank another submerged submarine. It was a one-in-a-million shot, and Launders had made it. HMS Venturer returned to base as a hero ship. Lieutenant Launders received the Distinguished Service Order for his incredible achievement. But the British didn't know what they had just sunk. They knew they had stopped an important German submarine, but they had no idea what was on board. U-864 settled on the rocky bottom of the Norwegian coast and was forgotten as the war ground to its conclusion. Germany surrendered 3 months later in May 1945. For decades, U-864 sat undisturbed. The wreck was deep enough that casual divers couldn't reach it, and the Norwegian coast is cold, dark, and treacherous. The exact location of the wreck wasn't precisely known. Over time, the story of U-864 and its cargo became the stuff of legend. Treasure hunters became obsessed with the idea that somewhere off the Norwegian coast was a Nazi submarine loaded with gold. $3 billion just sitting there, waiting to be claimed. The problem was finding it. And even if you found it, how do you salvage a broken submarine from the ocean floor without the gold spilling out and being lost forever? The wreck was finally located in 2003 by the Norwegian Navy during a routine survey. They found U-864 lying in 2 pieces at a depth of about 500 feet, which is diveable but extremely dangerous. The Norwegian government immediately declared the site a war grave and prohibited any salvage operations. But there was another problem, one much more serious than treasure hunters. Remember that mercury I mentioned? 67 tons of it. Mercury is extremely toxic, and the containers holding it inside U-864 were corroding. Scientists discovered that mercury was leaking from the wreck into the surrounding waters, contaminating the marine ecosystem and potentially threatening human health. The Norwegian government faced a dilemma. Do they leave the wreck alone and risk environmental catastrophe as more mercury leaks out? Or do they disturb a war grave and risk an international incident? Not to mention the technical nightmare of trying to safely recover or contain toxic materials from a broken submarine. After years of debate, they decided to act, but not to salvage the wreck, to bury it. In 2016, Norwegian authorities began a project to entomb U-864 under thousands of tons of sand and rock. The plan was to essentially build a sarcophagus around the submarine, sealing it and its toxic cargo away from the ocean forever. The project cost over $40 million and took years to complete. And that's where the gold mystery gets complicated. If there really was Nazi gold on U-864, it's now buried under a man-made mountain of sand and rock at the bottom of the Norwegian Sea. It's not technically impossible to reach, but any salvage operation would require Norwegian government approval, which they've made clear they will never grant. The site is monitored, and any unauthorized diving is illegal. So is there really gold down there? The truth is, we don't know for certain. German records from the end of the war are incomplete and often destroyed. Some historians argue that the gold story is exaggerated or entirely false. They point out that by late 1944, Germany was desperately short on gold reserves. The Nazi regime had already looted most of the gold from occupied countries and spent it on the war effort. Other historians argue that's exactly why gold would have been on U-864. If Germany was going to send one last mission to Japan, they would have scraped together whatever gold they had left to pay for the resources they desperately needed. Some estimates suggest the submarine carried anywhere from 2 to 10 tons of gold bars, with a current value between $100 million and $3 billion, depending on which estimate you believe. What we know for certain is that U-864 was carrying something valuable. The mission was considered critical enough to attempt multiple times despite engine problems. The cargo included advanced weapons technology and strategic materials. Whether that included a fortune in gold may never be definitively proven. There are other Nazi U-boat treasure stories that add to the legend. U-534 was sunk in the final days of the war and later salvaged. It contained mysterious sealed containers that treasure hunters believed held valuables, though nothing extraordinary was ever confirmed. U-977 surrendered in Argentina after the war, leading to persistent rumors that it had evacuated Nazi officials and gold to South America. The most famous is probably the story of U-3503. which was reportedly carrying gold and documents when it was scuttled by its own crew in the Baltic Sea. Despite numerous salvage attempts, nothing definitive has been recovered. Then there's the tale of U-461, supposedly carrying gold to Argentina when it was sunk in 1943. Again, nothing confirmed. What makes U-864 different is that we know exactly where it is, and we know it was carrying something valuable enough to risk the mission multiple times. The Norwegian government's decision to entomb it rather than salvage it means we may never know the full truth about what was on board. The story of U-864 represents the desperation of Nazi Germany in the final months of the war. It shows how far they were willing to go, how much they were willing to risk, on increasingly unlikely plans to avoid defeat.